interrogation, transfer, death and burial of Lee Harvey Oswald is quite a story. And I think it'll give you an idea of what the police department was up against, what type of personality that Lee Harvey Oswald had, and give you a little bit more idea of what, really how screwed up the young man was. Remember, he's 24 years old. I think we all think of this assassination, we picture Lee Harvey Oswald as being, an older person. He's 24, okay, 24 years old. Some of you may have brothers and sisters about that age, I don't know. So he was not a real worldly, mature individual, but very bright, very bright. So kind of what we talked about last was that he's arrested in the Texas Theater, right? And they're bringing him out of the Texas Theater, and they're going to take him back to police headquarters. That's where we're at, right? Okay. Well, after they escort him out of the Texas Theater, and by the way, it's in front of an angry mob, many are willing to take him because they have heard rumor that he also might have been the man that assassinated President Kennedy. So there's a lot of things flying, okay? But basically at this point, they're taking him out of the Texas Theater because they believe he shot a police officer. Well, they put him in the back of a police car, and there's two officers, one on each side of him, and two officers in the front of the car. And right off the bat, one of the officers asks Oswald his name. And basically there's just silence. And finally Oswald blurts out, "Why are you treating me this way? All I did was go into a theater with a pistol." Well, right away that makes you think, if he thinks that's okay, you kind of got to wonder just a little bit about him. Well, Oswald was then told that he killed a police officer, in which Oswald acts surprised and says, "A police officer's been killed?" At that point, the officers decide to go through Oswald's wallet, and they reach into Oswald's back pocket, they pull out his wallet, and they're looking at the contents of the wallet, and they pull out an ID which has the name Lee Harvey Oswald on it. And they ask Oswald if he's Lee Harvey Oswald, and there's only silence. Well, they continue to go through his wallet, and they find a second ID. And it's almost identical to the first one, only this one has his picture on it, and the name is Alec J. Heidel. You can pass that around. That's a copy of that ID. So the police are a little confused, and they ask him, "Well, are you Alec Heidel?" And he again refuses to answer. Nothing really more is said. They're tired of talking to him. They ride to police headquarters. Now, at 1:58 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald and police arrived from the Texas Theater to police headquarters in downtown Dallas. And that moves us to another subtopic, which is Oswald at police headquarters. Well, after arriving at the Dallas police headquarters, Oswald's taken to the third floor, and it's important you kind of get a picture of this, room 317, which is the homicide and robbery division of the Dallas Police Department. And they put the assassin into a small holding room, and he's got his arms handcuffed behind him. And by this time, on November 22nd of 1963, the Dallas police has the following evidence against Oswald for the murder of Officer Tippett. They've got eyewitnesses, right? Especially Helen Markham and Ted Calloway. They find 4 spent .38 shell casings in the grass near the shooting that matched Oswald's gun. Police officers witnessed Oswald attempting to shoot police officers in the Texas Theater. Well, once Oswald was placed in that holding room at police headquarters, it was then realized that he fit the description of what? The man that shot President Kennedy. So as far as the killing of President Kennedy, you got to keep this in mind. The evidence is not as clear as the evidence that was accumulated in the Tippett shooting. Here's the following evidence that the Dallas police had in the assassination of President Kennedy. We talked about this. They had the rifle used in the assassination. They had the 3 spent shell casings from the rifle that were found by the window of the 6th floor of the School Book Depository building. Police verified that Oswald worked in the building in which the assassination occurred. Police verified that Oswald had access to the 6th floor of the building at the time of the assassination. Police verified Oswald was the only employee who left the depository right after the shooting, and they had that eyewitness. They had an eyewitness who saw Oswald shooting from the 6th floor window. What is the evidence they don't have? What can't they tie him to? The rifle. They can't tie him to the rifle yet. And that's going to be the key. Before they can really charge him in the murder of President Kennedy, they're going to need to be able to tie him to the rifle that they found on the 6th floor of the depository. So Oswald sits in the holding room on the 3rd floor of police headquarters, and Captain Will Fritz, we talked about him, he was the one that went to the depository and went to the 6th floor and looked at the evidence. He's the guy that's going to interrogate Oswald. And he's a very highly respected law enforcement officer. He's headed up every homicide in Dallas for the past 30 years. And the feeling is, if anyone could get Oswald to confess to the killing of the president, it would be Captain Will Fritz. He was that experienced. Well, Fritz returns to police headquarters from the Texas School Book Depository, and he has the following information. He witnessed the sniper's nest on the 6th floor of the School Book Depository. He saw the rifle used in the assassination, and he had the name of the missing employee from the School Book Depository. Keep in mind that he has not yet seen Oswald, only knows his name. Okay? So he doesn't know that Oswald is in that interrogation room waiting for him. He doesn't know that yet. Okay? Keep that in mind. All he knows is that Oswald's been captured and arrested for the murder of police officer J.D. Tippit. Now, this is kind of a convoluted story, so please pay attention here. Captain Fritz at this time wanted to secure a search warrant for an address in Irving, Texas, which is another suburb of Dallas. And he got this address in Irving from Oswald's application for employment at the School Book Depository. Okay? He's looking for Oswald. He doesn't know that he's in custody waiting to be interviewed. And he got this address because when Lee Harvey Oswald filled out his application to work at the Texas School Book Depository, he put that address in Irving instead of the North Beckley address. So Fritz thinks this Lee Harvey Oswald character lives in Irving. So after securing the address in Irving, Captain Fritz gets 2 police officers and he tells them to secure a search warrant to go look for Lee Harvey Oswald in Irving. Well, when one of the officers realized that Captain Fritz was looking for Lee Harvey Oswald's whereabouts, he said to Captain Fritz, "Well, Captain, you don't have to go out to Irving to get him because there he sits." And because he was already in his office and he didn't know he was there. So Lee Harvey Oswald was taken to Captain Fritz's office by police officers, and then Captain Fritz is going to arrive and begin his interrogation. This is an interesting thing, so just kind of listen through it. Now, from the time Lee Harvey Oswald arrived at Dallas Police Headquarters, it was the goal by the end of the day to officially charge him with the murder of President Kennedy. They had more than enough to charge him on the murder of J.D. Tippit. All the evidence I talked about. More than enough. But they wanted to get him charged by the end of the day. Well, one thing that Fritz was known for, and he really wanted, is he wanted to get a confession on him. Charging him because of evidence is one thing. Getting him to confess that he shot the president's a whole different deal. And being Fritz was so good at that, that was his goal. Well, he would have time to try to get Oswald to confess because he could hold him without bail. Why? He had all kinds of time. He had the whole day to try to get him to confess. Why could he hold him on bail? Without bail, because he shot police officer Tippit. So he didn't have to hurry up because he was going to get somebody to get him out of there. Okay, he was going to be held without bail because he shot a police officer. So the interrogation begins. Captain Fritz is in a very calm voice, and he asked Lee Harvey Oswald what his name was. And Oswald responded by saying, "You know my name, you've got it in the papers." And Captain Fritz says in return, "Well, why don't you tell us yourself for the record?" And he says, "Lee Harvey Oswald, my name is Lee Harvey Oswald." Well, what would you ask next? You'd ask about the other identification card. So Fritz asked Oswald about the other identification found on his way to the Dallas Police Department, which was the name A.J. Heidel. And he asked Oswald if that name was an alias, and Oswald simply responded by saying it was something he picked up in New Orleans, which makes no sense to you now, but it will later, the New Orleans connection. Well, Oswald begins to complain about the handcuffs being too tight behind his back. Captain Fritz thinks, if I treat this guy kind of like a human being and treat him well, he may respond better, so he orders the handcuffs to be unhandcuffed from the back, which was uncomfortable, and they handcuffed him in the front. Okay? At this point, the conversation between Captain Fritz and Lee Harvey Oswald is going pretty well. Oswald's relaxed and calm, and he's responding to Fritz's questioning. Well, that all changed at 3:15 p.m. when an FBI agent by the name of James Hosty, that's this fellow right here, enters the interrogation room to listen to what's going on. Now, this is an interesting story in itself. When Hosty walked in, he introduced himself to Oswald. And as soon as Oswald heard his name, he just erupts like a firecracker. And he pounds his hands violently on the table in front of him, and he says the following to Hosty. He says, "This man's been harassing my wife. My wife is a Russian citizen and is protected by diplomatic law from harassment by the FBI. Your FBI is not better than the Nazi Gestapo." His wife was from Russia. He defected to Russia. All of this you'll find out later. And this guy has been harassing his wife, according to Oswald. Oswald had actually earlier sent a threatening letter to Agent Hosty at the Dallas FBI office for harassing his wife. Now, Captain Fritz is just sitting there going, what in the world's going on here? He has no idea that Oswald has any connections to Russia. None at all. Oswald had spent 3 years in Russia from 1959 to 1962, and he married a Russian woman there, which we'll talk about later, and ever since he got back, he would be under FBI surveillance. Why would that be?
Russia is coming.
Yeah, we're in the middle of a Cold War, and when some American comes back from Russia with a Russian wife, they're going to keep an eye on him, right? Because they don't have any idea what the deal is. Now, 2 weeks before the president was assassinated, Hosty actually went to Irving, Texas, because he wanted to talk to Lee Harvey Oswald, because he got information that he had come back from Russia, and it was his job to keep an eye on, okay? He believed Oswald was living in the Irving address. Why? Same as Fritz, because that's the address he put on his application when he went to work at the Texas School Book Depository. Now, Hosty arrives, and this is important you know, at the home of Ruth Payne. And when he arrived at the home of Ruth Payne, he discovered that Oswald's wife, Marina, was living there with her 2 children. Lee and Marina were separated. I think I maybe told you that before. He was very abusive to her. They didn't get along real well. She had made friends with Mrs. Payne. Mrs. Payne was interested in Marina because she was Russian. Mrs. Payne was a very conservative Quaker, thought it would be very wise to know the language of your enemy, and the Russians were our enemies at that time. And so she kind of allowed Miss Marina to stay there with her 2 children in exchange for having her teach her how to speak Russian. Well, Mrs. Payne was also estranged from her husband. They were separated, and she had 2 children, and so they had a lot in common. They were 2 separated women with children, and so it made it actually a pretty good combination. Well, when Agent Hosty discovered that Oswald didn't live in Irving with Mrs. Payne and Marina, he asked Marina how he could get in touch with him, and this seems crazy to believe, but neither one of them knew where Lee Harvey Oswald was living. They didn't know he was what the address of the boarding house was. Marina wasn't that interested in knowing that. And of course Ruth Payne didn't care because Marina didn't care. Does that make sense? She was separated from her husband. Well, Hosty left Marina one of his business cards and asked her to tell Lee to call him if she ever got a hold of him. And Marina gave Hosty the address of the Texas School Book Depository where Oswald worked. Okay, now I want to point that out. So he goes out and talks to Marina. And she says, well, Lee doesn't live here. Well, where does he live? Well, I don't know, because we're separated. Well, he gives him this card and says, if you get a hold of Lee, you know, let him know I'd like to talk to him. And she gives him the information that he works at the Texas School Book Depository, yet Hosty does not go to the Texas School Book Depository to talk to him. Now, keep that in mind, because that's going to come out later on, okay, that he didn't do that. Well, he doesn't do anything for those 2 weeks, and the president gets assassinated by the guy that he's supposed to be keeping an eye on, right? So what would you do if that happened? You would probably say, oh, I dropped the ball, and you'd probably grab this guy's file, this Lee Harvey Oswald, and you'd go through it and see what in the world was in that file that you didn't, you know, pay attention to. Well, he's very shocked to discover that a new file came in just a couple of days prior to the assassination. So information's coming in on this Lee Harvey Oswald to the FBI, and Hosty's kind of dropped the ball and hasn't been paying attention for 2 weeks. Does that make sense? from the time he went and talked to Marina to the assassination, he didn't really do much concerning Lee Harvey Oswald, and now this guy shot the president, okay, or he's in custody for it. Well, this new file that comes into the big file just 2 days prior to the assassination is a letter that Oswald had written to the Soviet embassy. And this letter mentioned that he had been in Mexico City in late September of 1963, and he had visited both the Cuban and Soviet embassies there. Now I'm going to explain that to you because he was in Mexico City. He came back from Russia, things weren't going very well, his wife and he weren't getting along, having a hard time finding a job, finds his job at the Texas School Book Depository, he doesn't really like it. So he goes to the Mexico City, he goes to the Cuban embassy and he says, hey, how about if you give me a visa to go to Cuba? They said no. So then he goes to the Russian embassy in Mexico City and says, hey, how about if you give me a visa to go back to Russia? And they said no. And so then he came back to the United States and continued, in my opinion, his pathetic life. Okay? Now, I'm going to throw something in here that's kind of crazy here. Because recently you've heard about President Trump releasing these new files on JFK. And they suppressed 200 documents that had to do with the CIA. Well, those CIA documents that they suppressed that you're not getting a chance to see are documents basically showing how incompetent the CIA was in giving information to the FBI that Oswald had been in Mexico City and had returned back to Texas. The CIA didn't communicate with the FBI, and the reason the CIA doesn't want those documents out right now in 2017-18 is because it makes them look foolish that they had dropped the ball. Okay? Well, this file that came in 2 days before the assassination came from where? Who sent it to him? CIA. Okay, well here's the key to this. In this letter, Oswald stated that he had visited a guy by the name of Valery Kostakov. He said it in the letter. So in the letter that Posty's looking at, that came in 2 days before the assassination, it states in the letter that he had been to Mexico City and he had had a conversation with Valery Kostakov. It just so happened that Valery Kostakov was in charge of all political assassinations in the Western Hemisphere. And Oswald had had a discussion with him. So if you're hosting, what's going through your mind? Think about that. I want you to really think about that. If you're hosting and you say, oh my God, it's 2 weeks later and this Oswald character that I was supposed to be following around just shot the president, and you open up his file and you see this letter that's been there 2 days, right? And it says, in Oswald's writing, it says, I've been to Mexico City to try to get these visas to Cuba and Russia. And by the way, I met with Valery Kostakov. And Valery Kostakov is the lead assassination man. He heads up all political assassinations in the Western Hemisphere. What are you thinking if you're hosting, Brady? Well, you'd be way more than that. You're thinking, if he met with the guy that's the head of the political assassinations in the Western Hemisphere, what do you think that would make you think in your mind? Absolutely, that the Russians were behind this assassination, right? And if that's the case and that comes out, what's going to happen between the United States and Russia? We're going to go to a war, and that's going to be a nuclear war. So the whole point of this story is to tell you that Hosty sees this, and he goes, oh my God, I've got to go talk to this Oswald character and see if he has any ties in with the Russian government, and if it was the Russian government that ordered this hit on President Kennedy. So what does he do? He rushes to the interrogation room, and that is why he's there. Now, does that all make sense? When you think, what's the guy doing there in the first place? He's trying to get information. He wants to know if he's been to Mexico City. He wants to know what went on. So, as you talk about this whole thing, this is the reason Hosty arrives at Dallas Police Headquarters during this interrogation of Oswald, and Hosty wants to talk to Oswald to see if he was part of some Soviet or Soviet-Cuban plot against the United States by killing our president. Okay? Well, Hosty gets into the interrogation room. Oswald gets upset, as we mentioned. Fritz has to calm him down. Now, Hosty at this point decides, I better back off and just listen, because we're not going to get anything out of Oswald if he's upset at me. So he just kind of sets back and lets Fritz continue his interrogation. Okay? And he tells Fritz, hey, I'll tell you why I'm here later. Because Fritz has no idea of any of this, okay? Well, after this exchange between Oswald and Hosty, Captain Fritz continues his interview with Oswald. And Agent Hosty sets in on the interview, like I mentioned. And Captain Fritz asks Oswald 3 direct questions. Do you work in the school book depository? Do you have access to all rooms in the depository? Why did you leave the depository? Well, he answers yes to the first 2 questions. He did work in the school book depository. He did have access to all rooms. And when asked why he left the depository, he simply said, I didn't think there would be any more work after the assassination. Well, Fritz's next question is, you know, a pretty simple question. He basically states, what? What's he state? What's that? He asks him why he left work. He says he didn't think there was any more work. What would be your next question you would ask him?
Why'd you go home?
Not yet. Not why'd you go home, because you left. Where did you go? Well, Oswald states he went to a boarding house to change clothes, get his gun, and go to the movies. Seems a little odd. And he asked him, why would you take a gun to the movies? And he says, because I felt like it. This is the type of thing, this is the economy or whatever of Lee Harvey Oswald. He just is off the wall. Well, Oswald admitted to pulling his pistol at the theater. He stated it was wrong, and he said, you know, I was clocked for doing it, probably deserved what I got. So he admitted pulling the pistol on the officers, and he said, I should have probably done that. But you know what, I got clocked for it, because remember Paul Bentley punched him, right? And he says, I deserve what I got. Well, then Fritz asked Oswald more questions. Did you bring a rifle to work? Do you own a rifle? Did you ever own a rifle? And Oswald answers no to all 3 questions. Then he asked him if he had any firearms training, and he said that he did when he served in the Marine Corps, because Oswald